Lorelei and Fleurdelys are the two newest holograms to come to the game, with both of them having different takes on what a challenge is. They both brought some big changes to their movesets. However, Fleurdelys was already a rather skill-based fight before getting a hologram, and let's just say she didn't get any easier. So in this video, I want to talk about both the new holograms by giving my thoughts on the new bosses, including the things that I liked, the issues that I encountered, any tips and tricks that I've found, and finally if I consider either of them to be the new hardest hologram. Now this is going to be a bit different from how I normally do my hologram videos, and I'll explain why at the end. But let's get started with Lorelei. Lorelei is one of the best looking holograms we've seen so far, especially her phase 2, as her mermaid form looks fantastic, having some beautiful vibrant colours. However, this might be a bit harsh, but she's really simple to the point where the fight itself doesn't really feel great at all. In a way, it's like a weird version of Monkey, because she does the same moves in the same order every single time. This makes the vast majority of her difficulty fade away as soon as you start to pick up on the attack patterns. This is mostly disappointing because even though she's repetitive like Monkey, she doesn't have that same power Monkey has. So you're not only able to predict what she's going to do well in advance of her doing it, but she also doesn't have enough damage to punish you for when you don't dodge her attacks. And lastly, her attacks themselves are very well telegraphed, which is kind of a positive, having no attacks in either of her phases that hit super fast. So when you add all of these points together, she feels very underpowered for what she brings to the table. Now, she is by no means easy. She can not only punish aerial characters pretty hard, but she can also punish characters with damage windows like Shang Liao and Carlotta. However, with good planning and positioning, these can both become a non-issue pretty quickly. Now, she did have a couple of issues that I encountered throughout the fight, like lingering damage that can hit you after the attack's animation. She has this healing bubble in phase 2 that tracks towards Lorelei, which you can intercept to stop her from getting the healing over time and instead get it yourself. However, some of her attacks have her dive underground where the bubble will follow her, making it so that the player can't intercept it. Now, this isn't necessarily bad, as the healing it provides is pretty easy to DPS through, but it did still feel a bit cheap when I couldn't stop it because it had gone off screen. However, the biggest issue that I had with this fight was how boring it was to solo. Her vibration bar is so tanky that unless a character has some form of additional vibration reduction in their kit, it's impossible for a solo character to get her into phase 2, which is in my opinion the harder stage of the fight. So it's essentially locking solo players out of what we're typically looking for, which is the challenge of the boss. This was incredibly disappointing as it just made the boss unrewarding to beat. Now, I am talking from the perspective of a solo player right now, but funnily enough, my teams ran into a similar issue, being able to burn her health down before she could get into phase 2. I honestly think this boss could be a lot better if Kuro made a few changes. First would be giving her hologram a stage modifier similar to Crownless's, which would allow solo players to do vibration damage and get her into that harder phase 2. Next would be letting her recover from immobilize quickly like Tempest, so she can actually get into her second phase without being nuked down beforehand. And third, I think the healing bubble should either spawn on screen so the player can see it and intercept it before it goes underground, or just make it so that it can't go underground. Other than that, she doesn't really have any unique issues, with most of her other problems being general combat issues that the game already has. So my tips for beating this hologram mostly revolve around having a good plan when fighting her. A good example of this is when she throws the big bubble attacks. You can completely avoid this by just utilizing a range character or being at range when she throws the bubble, then use another character's intro skill to reposition to Lorelei, avoiding the attack and its follow-up pulses. If you happen to see the healing bubble, this is always worth trying to pick up, as the healing it provides is so strong that you can basically face tank all of her abilities for a short period of time. I would even recommend purposely getting hit, provided you can survive it, if doing so means you can intercept the bubble. It can also pay to look around the arena at the start of phase 2, as this is typically when the healing bubble will spawn.
Good.
Now, something I want to mention about the bubble, the healing effect is only for the character that picks it up. So you might want to plan who you're going to give it to instead of just picking it up with whatever character is active. For instance, Shorekeeper might not need the healing as much, but Zani could make good use of it during her rotation. Lastly is some more general tips, like don't go rushing back into AoEs just because the animation is finished, as they can have lingering damage. And prioritize safety over your rotation. Yes, it's really cool when killing a boss super quick, but when dealing with harder hitting bosses, it's not going to feel as cool when your character is dead on the floor. Overall, she's a good looking boss who rewards pattern recognition and planning. So she's not a bad boss in my opinion, but unfortunately she doesn't feel like much of a challenge, and especially for solo players, she can be a very boring fight. So let's move on to our other new hologram, who I think most people will recognize.
Hey, you're that girl with the boobs!
Yep, that's what they call me.
Fleurdelys is so close to being one of my favorite bosses, having not only one of the best challenges that we've seen come to the game, but also her design is one of the best we've seen. Her combos offer a lot of variety. She has these really cool one-liners mid-fight that not only help you identify some of her attacks, but also add to the experience of the fight. And I personally think that she's one of the best holograms we've seen come to the game so far, bringing a level of difficulty that doesn't feel overly inflated by cheap bullshit game mechanics. When I imagine what sort of bosses I hope to see come to the game, she might not be my first pick, as I'll always prefer fighting big dragons over big titties. However, fighting an enemy that feels more like a rival or a challenger does have its own appeal. But sadly, even though I like this boss, she also has bugs and issues that can sap a lot of the fun out of the fight. Some of her attacks, especially in Phase 2, can be incredibly difficult to see, as most of her effects, with a good example being the coordinated attacks from her blades, are a similar colour to the arena's background. Throughout the fight, she can do these dumb little repositions way too much, sometimes doing them 4, 5, or even 6 times in a row without doing a single attack, which can increase the frustration felt by players using melee characters with suboptimal movement, or even characters that have longer wind-ups for their harder hitting attacks. This is the main reason I didn't use Dan Jin when beating her in my first clear, as my whole original plan was to make a video of 2 small girls versus 2 big ones, being Carlotta versus Lorelei and Dan Jin versus Fleurdelys. But the constant repositions just made the fight so unenjoyable that I just didn't want to deal with it at the time, so I decided to clear both of them with just Carlotta instead, because it was less frustrating. It's not a fun experience when you feel like you're just chasing a boss around an arena, and her repositions should have been limited to at most 2 in a row before her next action must be an attack. Some of her attacks also have incredibly shit hitboxes and can miss you for seemingly no reason. This was honestly so bad in some cases that you could just stand there not moving and the attack would still miss. Then I also ran into the opposite issue, where attacks that I had dodged would randomly hit me anyway, even directly after a successful dodge. Now, I'm sure this is an issue with the game, as combat currently has a lot of these sorts of bugs. However, it's never felt as frequent as it did with Fleurdelys. The most complex combo she has a few parryable attacks in it. However, if she does this after doing the phase transition combo for a second time, the parryable attacks will still show the parry indicator, but they can't be parried. Now, regardless of whether this was intentional or it's a bug, this is one of the shittiest attacks to deal with, because it punishes the player's skill while also not allowing them enough reaction time to deal with the attack on its own. I have the same problem with parryable attacks that can hit a character through a successful parry, as they just feel like cheap shots that don't reward skillful play on its own, as you also need the knowledge that the attack doesn't work the same way it normally does to know how to avoid it. Luckily, the vast majority of people are unlikely to experience this, as it happens at the very end of the fight, and it's really only going to surprise people that don't have enough DPS to burst it down at the end, and are also trying to parry the attack. Now, I do have a few tips for dealing with Fleurdelys that I hope can help some players out who might be struggling. However, even with these tips, I almost guarantee she will still be a difficult fight. Be careful when bringing airborne characters. Aerial dodges are not only really shit at dodging attacks, but she also has a few attacks that can punish airborne characters more than others, with the worst one being an insanely fast blade swarm that can even be hard to dodge for characters on the ground. When I was using Brand, I was able to dodge this attack successfully, only to have it one-shot me anyway after the time slow. Now, like we mentioned before, some of her attacks' hitboxes are really bad, so something I would recommend doing if you're trying to dodge her attacks and not avoid them is dodge in the direction of the attack's damage. For example, if she's doing a dashing stab, dodge backwards with the dash. If she's doing a slash attack, dodge into the attack instead of away, and when she throws blades at you, dodge towards them to try and increase the odds of triggering a perfect dodge. Now, speaking of the blades she throws at you in Phase 2, you can actually parry these and their damage can be reflected onto Fleurdelys. However, the safest way to avoid them is to keep an eye out for these glowing effects floating around and dodge towards them immediately as you see them. However, these are very likely to hit you throughout the fight anyway, as they can be incredibly difficult to see even when you know what you're looking for. If you're struggling with her phase transition combo, there are 3 main ways I would recommend dealing with it. First is staying in the circle at the center of the arena. This will allow most characters in the game to dodge counter through all the damage pretty reliably, and after all of my testing, this is my new favorite method for dealing with this attack. The second is to stand on top of one of the swords and do the same dodge counter strat. This was my original method because it allowed for better visibility during the attack. However, it's more prone to the further pulses hitting you if your positioning isn't right, so unless you really want to see the attacks coming, I wouldn't recommend it. Lastly, you can just run to the outer edge of the arena to avoid the whole combo, including the final massive AoE attack. This is the safest method, but it also has the most DPS downtime. If you're planning to dodge the attacks, being locked on can be rather helpful to know when she's going to start her initial attack after teleporting, as you can see the marker move from being in the air down to the ground, where she'll do her first attack shortly after. Some things to mention with her phase transition attack: it triggers when she reaches 80% health and again when she reaches 20%. However, the tell is not only easily missable, but it can also be immediately triggered during any of her other attacks, including after a successful parry. So when she starts getting close to 80% health, keep an eye out for this white effect surrounding her, as this will indicate the start of the attack. However, one more thing to mention: if she has lower than 50% vibration bar when she reaches 80% health, the attack will not trigger until she recovers from being immobilized. So you can actually use this to prolong her phase 1 if that's something that you want to do. Her most complex combo in Phase 2 starts with a very fast AoE pulse attack that has the potential to one-shot some characters, which can be rather hard to deal with. If you don't think you have the reaction time to dodge this, ranged DPS characters like Chisha, Carlotta, or even Phoebe can let you attack the boss from a safe distance and give you the option to avoid the attack by being out of range. However, if you do want to try and dodge this attack, try to be as close to her as you can and look for the ground effect that happens before the pulse. This can be a bit annoying to look for, as the effect is similar to the color of the ground, but from my experience, this is a lot more consistent than watching for her arm to move. You can also somewhat plan for this attack, as she's very unlikely to do it while above 50% health, but she's very likely to do it once her health is below 50%. Lastly, as this boss has some fast attacks that you need to be ready for, but also many delayed attacks throughout the fight, dodge locking is likely something most players will encounter. If you don't know what dodge locking is, when you quickly dodge twice in a row, there's a short period of time before you're able to dodge again. This is what I call dodge locking, and will leave you vulnerable to getting hit, especially from delayed attacks. So if you're unsure of the timing for an attack, slow down the intervals between your dodges, as letting each dodge's iframes extend your safety margin can go a long way in helping you deal with some attacks. So what are my overall thoughts on both the new holograms, and where do they rank against the others in terms of difficulty? Now, as much as I like Lorelei because she has an awesome design, unfortunately she doesn't really come close to what I would consider a hologram level challenge. She's too simplistic, she's too repetitive, and even though Monkey is arguably more simple, people still struggle with that boss because mistakes are heavily punished, often one-shotting most characters, whereas most of Lorelei's attacks are survivable. So even though she has more attacks to learn, she doesn't really punish mistakes for how repetitive her rotation is. It's like the devs designed this boss to be fought with one hand. Can't imagine why. So I would put Lorelei on the same level of difficulty as Monkey, but I think she's slightly harder for aerial characters. However, if Lorelei was designed for you to fight her with one hand, Fleurdelys was designed for you to fight her with 3. She is a contender for not only the best hologram in the game, but also the hardest hologram in the game. If it wasn't for her issues, I would argue she's one of the best bosses that I've fought in the last 2 years. However, this is the experience from a solo player, whereas if you have a full team and are utilizing intro skills and parrying, it's rather easy to bypass her phase 2. I have a feeling the reason she doesn't do her phase 2 transition attack while under 50% vibration bar was an attempt to force the player to experience the full attack without being able to immobilize her halfway through. The problem with doing this is the duration of her phase 2, which I would argue is a better challenge than her whole transition combo, is massively reduced the more damage that you can do beforehand. In a way, this makes her an incredibly simple boss, with some players being able to manipulate her phase patterns to the point where they only need to deal with her phase 1, followed by a phase transition attack at 80% health and a second at 20%. I'll try to record an example of this to play in the background so that you can see what I mean for yourself. What they should have done, in my opinion, is locked her vibration bar during the transition combo or have it fully regenerate similar to Dragon of Dirge, and always have it trigger at 80% health. This would have made it so that you not only always see the full transition combo, but you likely need to deal with her phase 2 attacks as well, making her a greater threat. Having said that, I imagine most players won't be completely bypassing her phase 2, so she is still an incredibly difficult fight. But how does she stack up against the other holograms? In terms of difficulty for a team, she's up there with my 2 current picks for hardest hologram, being Fallacy and Dragon of Dirge, and I honestly think she has the potential to be harder than both. However, because you can heavily reduce the amount of time that she'll spend in phase 2, which I would argue is the hardest part of her kit to deal with, having the most surprises, she just didn't have what it took to stop my teams from beating her. She still definitely deserves to be up there with the big 2, and if Kuro decides to either regenerate her vibration bar or lock it, as well as force the transition attack at 80% health, I think she would be the hardest hologram for a team. Now, in terms of difficulty to solo, I am going to give her the solo crown. However, I'm also not going to take it off Inferno Rider, and I want to explain why this is my choice. When I asked myself, without thinking, who is the hardest hologram to solo, I immediately thought Fleurdelys. However, I also decided to imagine a scenario where I was playing Dan Jin and I had to beat both Inferno Rider and Fleurdelys solo, but I only had one attempt to do so. Who would I be less likely to clear? The answer to that was Inferno Rider. Inferno Rider is still the hardest hologram to clear reliably, however I would argue that Fleurdelys requires more skill. So both of these bosses are difficult for different reasons, and in my opinion they both deserve the title of hardest hologram to solo. However, one thing that I'll say in favour of Fleurdelys, she was able to be as challenging as she is without having any annoying bullshit ground AoEs like Inferno Rider, and I think that deserves some recognition. Now, having said all this, this is just my opinion and I don't claim to be right. This is purely based on my experience, which is likely to differ from your own. And that's it. So I'd like to thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video or you got something useful from it, you can leave a like or a comment. And if you'd like to see more content in future, you can subscribe to the channel. Last thing that I want to talk about, for anyone who's seen my other hologram videos, you might notice the ability breakdown part of the video isn't here. This is for a few reasons. One, I did do this part of the video, but once I cut all the audio and footage down, the video was going to be over 40 minutes long, which is just ridiculous for a discussion video on the holograms. Two, I spent ages putting off making this video to start with because doing the kit breakdown saps a lot of my free time, which I never really look forward to. And three, I originally started doing it because I was hoping it would be helpful to other people, but it is a really boring part of the video and it even started making me dislike my own content. So if that was something that was helping you, I'm really sorry, I just don't think it's worth doing in the long run. But that will do it from me, so I hope to see you in the next video, and I'll catch you later.